In this lecture, we're going to talk in a little bit more depth about the data processor. We will start with the definition of data processor, which we've already come across. We will then look at the two parts of that definition. We will look at what is and what is not considered a processor. We will look at the activity-specific nature of processing and the importance of focusing on that activity. We will look at means of processing and then conclude with conditions under which a processor becomes a controller. As we've seen before, a data processor is a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So the first half of this is identical to the data controller. Again, natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or body. It's the second half which is important. And again, the data processor is processing on behalf of the data controller. So there are two parts to this definition. The first part is that the processor is a distinct legal entity from the controller, and again that the processor processes personal data on behalf of the controller. And so under what conditions might a processor be a processor and might it not be a processor? Well, a processor can be a subsidiary of a controller. A processor, however, cannot be a department within the controller's organization. And as we've already seen, it also cannot be an individual under the controller's direct authority. So an intern or other employee, someone who is designated by the controller to actually do the technical processing, that person is not a processor. It is just a person within the organization that is operating on the organization's behalf, and therefore that is the controller. Again, that person represents their organization. Another important heuristic or way of thinking about or trying to analyze processing activities, whether or not the processing of personal data falls under the scope of the GDPR, is to focus on the activity-specific nature of the processing. When trying to determine whether or not an organization is a processor or a controller, it's important to think about the activity itself. And so whether or not an organization is a processor or a controller is heavily dependent on context. We can't say that just because a processor is processing data on behalf of the controller, that they are always a processor. There may be some cases where in that relationship, a processor is also a controller. So again, activity specific. And I'm going to give you a concrete example in just a moment. And again, just to reinforce this, a single organization in a relationship can be a processor and a controller for different sets of personal data. So we want to focus on the activity. Here's an example because I know that's confusing. So I want you to imagine that we have two organizations. One of them is Widgets, Inc., and the second one is HR+. HR here for human resources. So Widgets, Inc. hires HR+ to administer employee benefits. Again, I want you to think that Widgets, Inc. is a small business. There may be just a handful of people here. They want to focus on their core mission, and so they take some of this administrative work and they outsource it. So HR+ in this context is a processor. HR+ uses the provided data to administer benefits to Widgets, Inc. employees. Again, they're processing this data on behalf of the controller, on behalf of Widgets, Inc. Now, at the same time, HR+ also retains point of contact or POC details for Widgets, Inc.'s procurement staff to manage the client service provider relationship. So imagine I'm an employee at Widgets, Inc., and you are someone at HR+. In order for you to provide me with your service, you need a point of contact. Who am I going to contact? How are we going to work together? What's the email address? And so you as an organization, as a business, you are collecting my personal data so that we can help to facilitate this relationship. In that case, HR+ is the controller for my personal data as a point of contact. And if there are other procurement staff that are involved, again, that's going to fall into a different bucket of activities. Now, when I give you all of the data for all of my staff to administer benefits, then in that case, HR+ is going to be the processor. So again, this is an example of how you want to focus on the activity-specific nature of the processing. When it comes to the means of processing, a controller can delegate the how. For example, the technical and organizational means of processing, security, record keeping, breach notification, cross-border transfer compliance. Remember, in a previous lecture, we talked about the essential and non-essential means of processing. If it's essential to the processing, then that's more likely to be the controller's responsibility. If it's non-essential, that's something that may be delegated out and could be the processor's responsibility. The three most important features that the controller is going to determine are the purpose, the legal basis, and the means through which data subjects can exercise their rights. All right, these three are really important and you need to remember them for the exam. You may come across a question that is explaining a scenario to you. You have multiple organizations or actors in the scenario, and you may be asked to determine, is this a controller or processor, or a joint controller, or are they both processors? And so in determining, you need to focus on the activity, okay? Is this organization determining the purpose, the legal basis, and how data subjects are exercising their rights? If so, that's going to be the controller. For our final slide here, again, just coming back to a point that we've already talked about, it's possible that a processor can become a controller. So a processor that uses controller-provided data to market its own products is considered a controller for that use case. And so if a controller provides a processor with their own data and says, hey, this is how I want you to process this data, this is the deliverable that I want, as long as the processor processes within those confines, then the processor is a processor. However, if the processor takes that data and determines a separate activity, if they determine the purpose and means, a new activity for that data, then the processor becomes a controller. For example, let's imagine again that we have another organization, another two organizations. We have Acme Corp, who's the controller, and Acme Corp hires MailMonkey as a processor to administer an email marketing campaign. Well, if MailMonkey later takes Acme's leads, the emails, takes those provided emails to market its own services. So I'm no longer going to send out emails to promote Acme's products or services. MailMonkey is now going to use that same data, but promote its own services. MailMonkey in this case becomes the controller because it has used this personal data for its own purposes. In this lecture, we went over data processor. Remember, a data processor is a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. There are two parts to this definition. Remember, a processor is a distinct legal entity from the controller, and they process personal data on behalf of the controller. A processor may be a subsidiary of a controller. However, it cannot be a department within the controller's organization, and it cannot be individuals under the controller's direct authority, such as an intern or an employee. Remember, when you're looking at different actors and you're trying to determine who is the processor, who is the controller, focus on the activity-specific nature of the processing. The distinction between a processor and a controller is activity-specific. It is not uniform for a particular organization. So a single organization can be a processor and controller for different sets of personal data, depending on the context and the relationship between those two. Concerning the means of processing, remember that the controller can delegate the how. However, the controller is solely responsible for determining the purpose, the legal basis, and for how the data subject will exercise their rights. Finally, remember that a processor can become a controller depending on how they use the data. A processor that uses controller-provided data to market its own products is considered the controller for that use case.